So, why is protecting the planet one of the biggest, one of the most intense battlegrounds in world politics? Well, it's not just about science. Nope. It's really about power, it's about money, and it's about this fundamental disagreement over who's responsible for the mess. Let's break it down.
Okay, to kick things off, I want to start with just one number, but it's a huge one. 663 million.
That's the number of people, right now, in developing countries who have no access to safe, clean water. Think about that. And this isn't just a humanitarian crisis, it's a political flashpoint. Why? Because it just throws into sharp relief the massive life-or-death scale of the environmental challenges we're all facing, and more importantly, how unfairly those challenges hit different parts of the world.
All right, so how does something like local water access blow up into a global political fight? To really get it, we've got to zoom out. We need to look at the bigger picture, at the shared pressures that connect every single one of us, whether we like it or not. I mean, just look at this list. The source material lays out a whole catalog of crises, from the very soil that grows our food to the atmosphere protecting us. And here's the kicker. No single government, no matter how powerful, can solve any of these problems by itself. They just can't. By their very nature, these are international problems, and that's what shoves them right onto the biggest stage of all, world politics. And this is exactly where science stops and politics takes over. The second you start asking these three questions, you're not just talking about ecology anymore. Suddenly you're talking about power, you're talking about money, and you're talking about blame and responsibility. This right here is the absolute heart of the conflict.
You know why? Because when the world actually tries to get in a room and answer those questions, a massive fundamental divide just cracks open. And it's a divide we see again and again, the split between the wealthy industrialized countries, what we call the global north, and the developing nations of the global south. And look, this divide didn't just pop up out of nowhere. As you can see from this timeline, the political alarm bells have been ringing for decades. You had early reports back in the 70s and 80s raising red flags. But it was really the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio that put these issues front and center, smack in the middle of global diplomacy. No one could ignore it anymore.
And boy, at that summit, the divide was just out there for everyone to see. You basically had two completely different conversations happening. The North was all about the big atmospheric stuff, ozone depletion, global warming. But the South? They wanted to talk about something totally different. They were asking, hey, how are we supposed to develop our economies without being saddled with all these new rules? You can see their point, right? To them, it kind of looked like the rich countries had climbed the ladder of development and were now trying to pull it up behind them.
So what do you do? How do you even begin to bridge a gap that wide? Well, to get anywhere, the international community had to come up with a whole new way of thinking, a really crucial principle to figure out who's responsible for what, in a way that, well, at least in theory, both sides could get on board with.
And this is what they came up with, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. I know, it's a bit of a mouthful, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. Imagine you're at a house party. At the end of the night, everyone should help clean up, right? That's the common part. But the person who threw the party and made the biggest mess, they should probably do a bit more of the heavy lifting. That's the differentiated part. So applied to the planet, it says, yes, we're all in this together, but, and this is the big but, the developed countries, the ones who've been pumping out emissions for over a century, they have a bigger responsibility to lead the cleanup.
And this wasn't just some vague, nice-sounding idea they talked about over coffee. No, it was formally written down, right here in the Rio Declaration. This quote is huge because it's the world officially saying you can't just ignore history. All that accumulated pollution from the industrialized world had to be part of the equation. Okay, so what did this principle actually mean in the real world? Well, it had massive consequences. Take the Kyoto Protocol. That was the first major climate treaty with legally binding targets. Because of this whole differentiated idea, huge developing countries like China and India were actually exempt from those first-round targets. The thinking was, hey, they need room to grow their economies, just like the developed world did, without being held back by the same strict rules right away. But all these high-level deals made in conference rooms and the economic decisions that flow from them, they don't just exist on paper. They create massive ripple effects for real people, for entire communities, and for local environments right down on the ground. And this is where you see some of the most powerful responses coming from the ground up. We're talking about grassroots movements, people fighting to save their forest in Mexico or Brazil, huge campaigns against giant mining corporations in the Philippines, or famous movements like the Narmabata Bachao Andolan in India, which fought against a massive dam project. For these folks, it's not abstract. They're literally fighting to protect the land and water they need to survive. You know, what these local fights also show us is a really fundamental difference in how we even think about nature. It's a total clash of worldviews. In much of the North, there's this idea of wilderness as a pristine place where people don't live, something you have to protect from humans. But in a lot of the South, that's just not how they see it. The environment is where people live. Humans are part of nature, not something separate from it.
Okay, so let's zoom back out one more time. Let's connect these very real local struggles to the huge global competition for the planet's most essential resources. This brings us to something called resource geopolitics. And really, it all boils down to the simple questions. Who gets what? When do they get it? Where and how? It's all about power and control over resources. And if you look back through history, this has been a major reason for rivalry, conflict, and even war for centuries.
Now, for the last 100 years or so, one resource has been king: oil. And this table shows you exactly why the Gulf region is so incredibly important in world politics. Get this. They produce about 30% of the world's oil, which is a lot. But they are sitting on almost 2/3 of all the known reserves on the planet. That staggering imbalance is why the region is, and always has been, a hotbed of geopolitical tension.
But as all-important as oil has been, a lot of experts are now looking at another resource, one that's quickly becoming the next potential flashpoint for major conflict, and that's fresh water. Seriously, some analysts have even started predicting that we'll see water wars in the 21st century.
And listen, this isn't just some sci-fi movie plot. The source points to conflicts that have already happened. We've seen actual violence erupt over shared rivers, like the Jordan River back in the 50s and 60s, and there are ongoing simmering tensions right now between countries over dams on rivers like the Euphrates. As water gets more and more scarce, you can bet these kinds of conflicts are only going to become more frequent.
And who's caught right in the middle of all of this? Between the high-level politics, the scramble for resources, and the damage on the ground, it's often the world's indigenous peoples. Their movements are so important because they shine a light on the human cost, how this constant push for development and resource extraction can mean losing everything: their land, their way of life, their entire culture.
So all of this leaves us with one final really provocative question, and it kind of gets to the very heart of this whole debate we've been walking through: the North versus the South, the global versus the local. Is the environment something to be saved from us, like a priceless object in a museum you put behind glass? Or is it something to be saved with us? Is it our home, a place to be managed and lived in, where people are actually part of the solution? How we answer that question, well, that's pretty much going to decide the future of our planet.